What's up, students? I'm going to be talking with you today about the New South, progressivism, and the world wars. This is the first in a series of chapter lectures over Unit 4 in the course, Arkansas History, Introduction to. And this is going to be Chapter 10 from the textbook Arkansas, A Concise History. So this unit deals with 1874, so the end of Reconstruction until 1945. So I want to start off talking about, I'm going to make mention of some scholarship here before I talk too much about New South Arkansas. Now, historian C. Van Woodward, he states of the period of the end of Reconstruction until 1891, that this was a time where relationships were more fluid between the races. Okay, so this is known as the Woodward Thesis, published in 1955 in The Strange Career of Jim Crow. This work has a major impact on the study of American race relations. It concerns the origins and timing and nature of both segregation and Jim Crow. And it was published just 1 year after the Brown versus Board, the Board of Education decision, which ordered schools desegregated. This book also offers an analysis of the history of Jim Crow laws in the South and argues that evidence for segregation in the South begins in the 1890s. Woodward argues that even under slavery, the two races had not been divided as they were under Jim Crow laws of the late 1890s. He also states that there was a considerable economic and political mixing of the races during the period, during the Reconstruction period. Woodward also coined the term Second Reconstruction. This first appeared in a journal article published in 57 titled The Political Legacy of Reconstruction in the Journal of Negro Education. This was 2 years after his publication of the book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Now, the Civil War provided a brief opportunity for some, and after the Civil War, Arkansas is also viewed by some as a Garden of Eden, where there are an influx of African Americans coming to the state. And if you refer to my previous lecture on who shot and killed John Clayton, you can kind of get some additional insight into that time period. Now let's start getting into Arkansas and the New South, 1874 to 1900 is going to be the main focus of this conversation, but Unit 4 will really deal with some of these same trends I'm going to be mentioning, which will last all the way until the Great Depression. So Arkansas and the New South. At the end of the Reconstruction, there was a depression. And also a regional movement led by Henry Grady. Grady grew up in the turmoil of Reconstruction period. He would speak across the country in attempts to get the North to make investments into the South. He spoke particularly to Northern audiences. He knew there was money there, and he wanted a different future for the South. Now, the New South Creed, this is a slogan used to call for modernization of the New South and to reject the traditions of the Old South. This is termed by Henry Grady. Now, the New South Creed was about looking forward, and it wanted the South to be more like the North. Now, the New South Creed, here's a series of questions. Why did the North defeat the South? What should the South do? Then what should the South do? What's their relationship to the North? And what are their relationships to blacks? Now, the lost cause myth. This said the Civil War is not about slavery, it's about states' rights. It held that secession was constitutional. And you see a lot of people holding on to that because there has been talk of secession by states all throughout the country's history. And even when we were framing our Constitution, that was a serious argument. So bringing the states together was an issue, and then the states maintaining their right to leave the Union goes on. In New England states and in Virginia and in South Carolina, and I mean it's not an uncommon idea. But this is a lot of people that are upholding that secession is constitutional. Now, I'm not arguing for that at all. I'm just stating that all throughout the country's history since the early republic, states have talked about secession. Northern states, New England states, Southern states, there's not a definitive trend, but it is obviously the Southern states that seceded from the Union during the Civil War. Now, the lost cause myth upheld that the South was an orderly Christian society and better than the North. So, in contrast to the New South Creed, the lost cause myth was about looking back, whereas the New South Creed is about looking forward. So the ideas of the New South Creed and the lost cause myth were side by side, really, and neither of them were really proponents of racial or social equality. Now, 1874 was a very turbulent period. Many people wanted order and stability. In an attempt to bring Arkansas back into the mainstream economy, at least three things would have to be done. Traditional agriculture would have to be restored to its former levels. There would have to be less reliance on one single crop, that being cotton. And also, like many places in the South, industrialization is going to be needed. Moneyhan states in this time period, time seems right for a change. Now, there's a lot of inertia in Arkansas, right? This idea that if an object is in motion, it will stay in motion. Arkansas is a very agrarian society. Farm products were 93% of production in Arkansas. And rural communities make up 97% of Arkansas, most being farms, most farms being commercial. Now let's talk about Farm Tennessee in 1890. By 1890, over 45% of Arkansans did not own their land, and sharecropping becomes the predominant agreement, and very much like slavery. You can kind of see the ramifications for this in the book that we deal with in my Arkansas history course, A Painted House. It's a great book. Read it. It's by John Grisham. There's also a film about it. Now, landowners constituted 70% of all farm units. Tenants made up 30% and were mostly former slaves. The tenant system would vary. Tenants would sign a contract where landowners would get a percentage of the crops, and the tenant farms the land. Sharecropping is supposed to be a temporary step to someone becoming a landowner if everything goes right and if everything goes according to plan. Now, a crop lien agreement, this is like a property loan, but if you don't pay, they will take everything back. Many tenants would sign a crop lien agreement for clothes, goods, supplies, etc. And this system ends up being a lot like slavery. Now, there's prediction in 1868. Here's a quote: "Cotton ought to go sky high next year." In 1874, there was actually had been a drop in cotton prices. Economic issues ensued because of a decrease in the value of cotton. By 1880, a family of 5 had at least 4 people working in the fields. Good year cotton production would mean half a bale per acre. This would mean 16 bales if there were 32 acres of cotton. There's a 10% ginning fee. The best you could hope to get is $960 worth of cotton. Then you would have to split half of that with the landowner, so you weren't making much profit. There's little room to survive under these conditions, and sharecroppers had to be self-sufficient, and it was a very difficult existence at best. Rural, isolated farmers only went to the county seat twice a year, once in the spring and the second in the fall, to sell their crop and pay their taxes. Now, here's a couple examples of sharecropping contracts. A landowner furnished a mule, feed, tools, and seed to a sharecropper. Sharecropper gets half of all crops except for cottonseed, 50 pounds of bacon, 21 pounds of flour, both paid for out of the sale of the crops. Here's another thing. Tenants often are illiterate. Another example, landowner would furnish goods and supplies plus $150 per year and food and clothes. There'd be a lien on all crops grown that year. A lien signs over all possessions. Credit was given as collateral. A farmer puts up all he owns. It can be seized if terms are not met. This happens often. Debts are often carried over to the next year, making prospects of getting out of debt very unlikely, and this creates a spiral of debt. Now, there are three social institutions that are central to the life of Arkansans and really defined people's lives. And I'm going to talk about each one of them in detail. And that is family, class, and race. And I will talk about some other social institutions that sort of spin off and tie into these institutions. So let's talk about family. It's almost impossible for a single person to survive in Arkansas at this time. So people married young, had a lot of kids. Men were able to be married at 17, women at 16. Love, not a necessity or prerequisite to this. There's a high infant mortality rate. The Arkansas family in the 1880s had about 5.5 members per family. There were gender-specific roles, but at the bottom of the economic ladder, the roles mixed. Arkansas was a patriarchal society. Women cooked, cleaned, washed, assisted with childbirth, and had to sit with the dying and take charge of funerals. So this would seem like a relatively easy life, right? Not at all. They had a terribly hard life and lived like serfs. Their childhood was brief and work would start as young as age 5. If the husband was sick, the wife would be required to step in. Now, in terms of education for women, there wasn't much need for classical education. Only half went to school. And anyone who went to school was off in the summer for work. Now, what did these people do for entertainment? They went to church revivals, they would visit family, and they would hunt. Now, look, there's not much of a need for classical education, only half going to school. That's not just with women. At an earlier point in American history, it was. You would see that women, their education was only emphasized to sort of raise better children, take care of their husbands, and pass on these Republican virtues, right? This idea of Republican motherhood. But here, I would say at the bottom of the ladder on these families we're talking about, that there was not much of a need for classical education. Now, class, urban and small towns are growing as well as the middle class post-Reconstruction during the New South period. Every county had elites, more so in urban areas than rural areas. Tenants, laborers, rednecks, and hillbillies become common. These groups increased during the New South and attached a stigma to being poor. Being poor would mean that you were white trash, essentially. Poor people are stereotyped as being lazy, and this is a very unfortunate and untrue judgment. In terms of social mobility, most people stayed poor. They didn't have much of a shot at moving up the economic ladder, and more people were headed down that economic ladder than up. During this time, childhoods are becoming longer, and age and gender roles are starting to change, and children are starting to no longer work in the fields. Okay, so it's a couple of notes on class. Now, race. By the 1890s, there were clear lines between the races, and Jim Crow laws began to appear. African Americans made up about 26% of the population, or 1 in 4 people in Arkansas. They were also stereotyped as rowdy, lazy, sexually potent, and uneducated. They had little to no political power. African Americans shared much with poor Arkansas whites, mainly poverty and little chance of getting ahead. Now, religion, the church as an institution, supported the social structure of family, class, and race. In the countryside, the predominant denominations were Baptist and Methodist. They would discipline their members. They would be churched. This would mean being removed from fellowship if they were not conforming to the societal norms. Church provided meaning for people as well as a social experience. And churches tried to keep the community together. They were opposed to drinking, promiscuity, profanity, lying, dancing. People were forced to conform to these social norms, or they would be ostracized. The influence of the church leads to the creation of blue laws, which close every business or most businesses on Sunday. These are norms that people followed. Some communities also allowed no ball playing. This falls by the wayside with the growth of towns, but as you know, if you live in Arkansas now, many liquor stores and other things are closed on Sunday, and also some businesses are closed on Sunday, and it's kind of the inheritance of that tradition. The church as an institution would provide a supernatural basis of authority in people's lives. Government and law are non-secular institutions that did the same thing as the church for family, race, and class. It's ran almost entirely by white men. County and local governments are the most important. Justices of the peace, which are county officials, are very important. A justice of the peace, I explain this to people. You have the mayor and you have the city council. Okay, well, that's what does things for the town. But for the county, you have the county judge, which is like the county mayor. And then you have justices of the peace, which are like county city council members. So that's if you understand, a lot more people understand more about city politics, where it's a little easier to understand. That's how it works within the county. So justices of the peace are very important county officials. Now, starting in 1874, Democrats held politics and continued to hold control until the 1960s. A few remarks on the legacy of the Bourbons or the Redeemers. Now, the Redeemers saw themselves as redeeming Arkansas from the horrors of Republican Reconstruction. These were extremely conservative Southern Democrats that really were a political dynasty in the New South. Redeemers were extremely fiscally conservative. They lowered taxes, limited state government action, provided few public services. They reinforced the economic position of the elites, and while limiting the future development of the state. These are the people that had the land, and they had the biggest influence in making the rules. And they also had a pay-as-you-go philosophy. There's a lot to overcome if there would be any real or significant change under these conditions for the state of Arkansas. Now, let's make some remarks on the railroads here, and then we'll get into some major social trends. Railroads were the key to economic development and change for the states. Railroads would integrate local economies into larger regional and national markets. That's going to be key. A second wave of railroads comes to Arkansas in the 1880s. Now, if you recall, there's only 38 miles of track before the Civil War, but by 1895, there are 2,373 miles of track in Arkansas. Railroads would make and unmake towns across the South. If a railroad came near a big town, people would move to the railroad area. Railroads declined communities like Norristown, which is on the outskirts of Russellville, Arkansas, where I currently live. There's an area known as Skyline that used to be Norristown, and when they put the railroad through Russellville, Norristown declines, Russellville booms. Same thing happened with Lewisburg and Morrilton. Now, railroad travel, a 1871 line from Memphis to Little Rock was finished. And there was also a line from Little Rock to Fort Smith and Van Buren created. So here's some comparison, okay? So from Camden to Prescott by stagecoach was 40 miles and would take 12 and a half hours and would cost $6, all by stage, okay? Now, in contrast, Prescott to Little Rock by train was 82 miles, okay? So further, twice as long. It would take 3.5 hours, that's quite a bit less than 12 and a half. It would cost only $4. It's cheaper. So you could see what a big impact that would make. An 80-mile railroad from Prescott to Little Rock would take 3.5 hours and would cost about $4 to $4.50, right? Railroads brought areas who weren't a part of the economy into the economy. This is, railroads also during this time are fighting off regulations and taxations. They did have a political influence. It's worth noting, if you remark back to some of the things we talked about during Reconstruction and the Clayton government, it's a fascinating topic to get into with the railroads there and how it grew from 38 to over 2,000 miles of track in that short of amount of time. Memphis replaced New Orleans as a place of economics, and St. Louis became a main economic center as well. During the 1870s, Arkansas was experiencing an economic boom with timber, minerals, and tourism. Two towns of tourism become Hot Springs and Eureka Springs. Eureka Springs, also often called the Switzerland of America. There is even a Switzerland-themed hotel that you can stay at there today. So let's talk about these two major social trends of urbanization, I've mentioned that previously, and integration into national markets and culture, okay? We'll finish up after that with the farm crisis and reasons that began. Towns are the primary beneficiaries of the economic boom of the 1880s. There's a growth in a new middle class of teachers, lawyers, doctors, engineers, and managers. from 1880 and in the 1900, you see a lot of towns really grow. Little Rock in 1880, 13,138 people grows to 38,307 people just in 20 years. That's amazing. Pine Bluff, 3,203 people grows to 11,472 people. Fort Smith grows from 3,099 people to 11,597 people. So major growth for Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and Fort Smith between the 1880 and 1900 census. There began to be greater ethnic diversity in these towns. The towns were a primary beneficiary of this economic boom, as I mentioned. And these towns develop a middle class. Now, a few more remarks on the type of middle class you would see here: teachers, lawyers, doctors, engineers, store owners, businessmen, shopkeepers, skilled workers, and managers. Now, due to urbanization, African Americans achieved some economic success, even elite status, and began forming their own businesses. This leads to a Black middle class emerging out of, despite of Jim Crow laws even existing. Barbershops, whites would not cut Blacks' hair, so you had to have barbers. Funerals, whites wouldn't cater to Black clients. Insurance companies, whites didn't service Blacks. Education, it just creates its own sort of industry to accommodate the African American market. Now, Booker T. Washington, he is a spokesperson for the Black community. He gives a speech in 1895 in Atlanta at the World Fair to a white audience. Washington urged Blacks to learn a trade, make a living in the South, and work hard, and not worry about being separate, but worry about being allowed. Now, Washington believed that Southern Blacks should submit to white political rule as long as they would be guaranteed education and due process. Now, his views here became known as the Atlanta Compromise. W.B. Dubois, and I'll follow up. The Atlanta Compromise was an agreement made between Washington and other African American leaders and white Southern leaders in the Tuskegee Institute to sort of fall in line with what Washington is saying. And that will be the way to move forward. Now, W.B. Du Bois, he's a Harvard-educated, Northern-born African-American man. Now, Du Bois believed that the talented 10th of African-Americans should have the same socio-political rights as whites. Du Bois first supported Washington in his Atlanta Compromise, but later opposed him. Now, in terms of the family, how did urban differ from rural life? There's a loss of traditions and customs due to the new lifestyles many were experiencing. Dad would go off to work in a factory and the mother stayed in a different sphere, and the two did not interact as much as they had done previously in Arkansas society. Children become more of a liability. Their lives actually do become longer due to changing conditions. Women begin to have a little more freedom. The good housewife ideology began, as well as gender roles. There began to be an appearance of women's clubs. There was a women's Christian temperance movement. This was really the breeding ground for women's suffrage. In 1920, the 19th Amendment would be passed, guaranteeing women the right to vote. And there was something brewing during this post-Reconstruction period pre-Great Depression in the female world in Arkansas. Religion became more diverse. Little Rock, again, 60% Methodist by this time, and 60% Methodist and Baptist combination, 23% Roman Catholic. Arkansas is beginning to approach problems with unity also. Now, let's talk about integration into national markets. So urbanization and integration into national markets and culture, these two major social trends going on in New South Arkansas. Now, integration in national markets, society integrated through the newspaper, telegraph, and telephone, and railroads. Now Arkansans can buy things that other people can buy. Arkansans are now becoming the same as Americans in other parts of the country. The Sears and Roebuck catalog would display the current national fashions. As towns grew, the central institution of urban life became the public school. Public schools emerged as a central social institution. Having a school was essential to community vitality. Consolidation of smaller schools would often lead to the downturn of a town. To lose a school could mean to lose a community. Now, beginnings in change in school functions and focus on education. A few here. How to think is being taught. The notion of challenging truth is a fixed thing. And observation and analysis are beginning to be emphasized. For most living in Arkansas, local and county government was the most important form of government. They were expected to provide more in these towns. Towns are coming up with new ways of governing. Infrastructure is not commonplace in the countryside. And stoplights start to become a sure sign of urbanization. Towns end up having to provide more services, fire departments, police, sewage, governments playing a larger role, such as defining and protecting professions mentioned earlier. Now, in 1870, there are little to no limitations on professions. By 1903, doctors had to pass a state exam and boards. By 1909, doctors had to have a degree from a college. If you were already a doctor, it meant that you had limitations put on your profession that you were currently serving in. But standards established credibility of the profession and limited competition. Pharmacists, engineers, teachers, lawyers are all standardized professions by this time. All of these things are attempting to bring about order in Arkansas society. Okay, now let's talk about the plight of the farmer and reasons for the farm crisis as we wrap up this lecture. Now, cultivation does improve between 1880 and 1900. Rice production develops in the Mississippi alluvial plain. Farm production in the New South, though, is not going according to plan. In 1879, only 35% of all harvested acres are cotton. By 1889, 45% is cotton. Farms were declining in size, efficiency, and productivity, and the soil is being ruined. Costs to run a farm were increasing, and it was difficult to get credit. There are also abuses in the farm finance system. Getting crops to market becomes costlier. There was bad weather in the 1880s and an infestation of plant diseases and pests such as the boll weevil, which eats cotton. It would bore out into the boll and eat out the lint. In 1881, drought. In 1882, a flood. Prices continued to decline throughout the 1880s and 1890s, and in 1865, cotton had been 83 cents per pound. In 71, it was 24 cents per pound. In 86, it was 9.4 cents per pound. And in 1898, it was 0.6 per pound, or 6 cents. Growing competition And overproduction led to a vicious cycle of debt and credit. Tenant farmers supposed to move up. By 1890, 45% of farmers are tenant farmers. This is actually less than most of the Deep South, by the way. By 1900, 3/4 of tenant farmers are black farmers, 30% are white tenant farmers. Now, in a material sense, African Americans are doing worse. There are diseases, health issues, hookworm issues, high infant mortality rates, and a life expectancy of 40 years for those involved in tenant farming. Poor whites and poor blacks were very similar and a part of an immobile and rural population. In 1879, if you were 10 years or older, 28.85% could not read or write. African American numbers are much greater at 75%. It became seen as a misfortune or injustice to be born in the state of Arkansas. Quite a transformation to when people are migrating here after the Civil War and under the impression it's a Garden of Eden. Farmers wondered why. They become very unhappy with the Democratic Party, but Democrats again are going to dominate Arkansas politics for 100 years after the Civil War. A populist party begins to form in the 1890s, and prices rose for crops in World War I. In the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, there were agrarian protests. Farmer organizations are asking why they were so poor. And the populist platform was as follows. They wanted to abolish national banks, reduce tariffs. They wanted a graduated income tax, enforceable usury law or loan laws, collection of back taxes on the railroads, prohibition. Farmers wanted silver as well as gold coinage. Now, with the defeat of William Jennings Bryan in the election of 1896, that really brings about an end to the populist movement that rises up in the late 1880s and early 1890s, mid-1890s. Prosperity does occur in the mid-1890s and continues for the first 2 decades of the 20th century and will continue until World War I. And that will include an investment in manufacturing, improved markets, and integration into national markets continued, and a demand for Arkansas products. Okay, so that concludes our Chapter 10 lecture for our textbook, Arkansas Concise History. Look soon for our Chapter 11 content. I'll be releasing that here in just a couple of days. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll talk to you soon.